chapter 15, verse 11. So following the Passover, the Israelites left town and they wandered a bit. And they ended up camped, and Pharaoh sees this, and he realizes that comes to realize that he's lost a huge labor force. And he senses that the Israelites are reluctant to wander into the wilderness for good reason. And so he decides to go after him and fetch him back. And so he sends out this huge force, and he traps the Israelites between his army and some body of water. But God, through Moses, instructs the Israelites to go forward and toward the water and see what he'll do. And they do that. And Moses stretches out his arm, and lo and behold, God parts the sea by a strong wind. And the Israelites are able to walk across this body of water, but when the Egyptians attempt to follow, God causes the sea to return, and they all drowned. And from the locations as recorded in the text, I contended that the Israelites exited this sea somewhere in the northwest part of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, this miraculous rescue resulted in a major strengthening of the Israelites' belief in not only Yahweh, but also in Moses as their leader. And so, while they're camped on the other shore, they celebrate their deliverance with a song and praise to God. And we ended up last time kind of in the middle of this. So, Trevor, do you want to start with verse 11 through 13?
Lord, who is like you among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, revered with praises, performing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. With your faithful love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. You will guide them to your holy dwelling with your strength.
So here they are comparing Yahweh to the pantheon of gods. And remember, they've been living with this notion of a vast multitude of gods for the last 430 years. And so, but it can't tell here whether the Israelites have come to recognize Yahweh as the only real God. It appears they haven't come to that yet. We'll see evidence of that later on. But they at least acknowledge Yahweh as the top God. And that would include all the gods of Egypt and Pharaoh himself. And as we've seen, that God has judged the gods of the Egyptians. And again, we see some superlative words here in this text. Words like majestic, holy, awesome, glorious, along with doing all of his wonders. And here they acknowledge the motive of God in doing what he's done for them in their redemption. It was his love for them. And this is the exact same motive that sent Jesus to the cross for our sakes. So, Rick, you want to take 14 through 16?
The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall upon them. By the power of your arm, they will be as still as stone, until your people pass by, O Lord, until the people who passed by. You will bring them in, plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, your hands established.
Okay, now since the Israelites haven't encountered any of these people groups mentioned here, this may be indicating that they anticipate what will happen. And they anticipate that the jungle telegraph is going to kind of spread the word about what's been done to the Egyptians on behalf of the Israelites. And that message is going to cause what is presented here. It's going to cause an overwhelming fear. Now, the mention of Philistia there in verse 14 could be a bit of a historical anachronism here, because the Philistines hadn't migrated into Canaan until later in the second millennium BC. So the possibilities are that the words of this song were inserted later, or that this is a reference to the Philistines while they were still in the Aegean Sea area, which is where they came from. All right, let's see, you read through 17, right?
Right.
Okay. So in 17, let's see, why don't you go ahead and read 18 too while you're there.
The Lord will reign forever and ever.
Okay. Right, so here's a reference to God's own mountain, where he will cause God's own people to be established. And I'm not sure they even know what mountain they're referring to. Moses might, however, since God had told him when they left Egypt, that as a sign they would worship on Mount Sinai. But none of the beliefs, but one of the beliefs in those cultures was that the gods resided on mountaintops, and I mentioned that before. So
Why
this
did they
might
think that?
Huh?
Why did they think that?
I have no idea why they thought that. That's
It's
just what
still
they
kind of
believed.
the thing,
The gods
isn't it?
resided on mountaintops. Maybe it's because it couldn't go any higher than that.
Okay.
Did they have volcanoes there?
They didn't, I don't know if they had any right there in that area. There is volcanoes up in the Golan Heights area, and of course around Greece, Italy. You know, they had their share.
Maybe you're right, what is it?
Mike, Sarah pointed out to me that, the reference to high places where there was idol worship and pagan worship, the verses that the Psalms that says, I lift up my eyes to the hills, where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. When they say, I lift up my eyes to the hills, what we're saying is, I look at what the world says is their God. Up the hills means to the high places. And where does my help come from? My help doesn't come from there. My help comes from the Lord.
Good.
Mm.
Good. Yeah. So anyway, perhaps this is just a way of saying God's going to establish them where he dwells. And ultimately, we know that they end up on a hilltop in Jerusalem as their worship place. And when you go there, you realize it's not much of a hill. So, and lastly, they ascribe Yahweh's sign as one that will never, or reign rather. Yahweh's reign is one that will never end. And they're right about that. Not only will it never end, but it's always been. Right, let's see. April, you want to do 19 through 21?
When Pharaoh's horses with his chariots and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the water of the sea back over them. But the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then the prophetess Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women came out following her with tambourines and dancing. Miriam sang to them, Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. He has thrown the horse and its rider into the sea.
Miriam here is described as a prophetess, so apparently she had some special gifting, which is quite common, really, for women to be considered as, to have prophetic abilities among the cultures of the age, and she is identified here as the sister of Aaron, so by default, she is also the sister of Moses.
Right.
Now, I'm going to make a guess here, and I'm going to do some speculating. I'm going to speculate that this is not a second episode. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is a description of what Miriam and the other women did when the singing started, because they say the same exact words here.
Mm.
Now, and they did with the addition of the tambourines and the dancing. Now, if you don't agree with that, don't worry, your salvation will not be affected.
It's like the
But
chorus.
regardless, this is a pretty festive occasion. It's enough to make them sing and dance in exaltation. These are expressions of uninhibited joy. Now, I don't know if this puzzles anyone but me. With all that they needed to carry, why'd they bring tambourines?
Never thought of that one.
They're music people.
They must have been.
They have their Mike Richardson.
I guess
Yeah,
so.
I mean,
Yeah. I mean, tambourines wouldn't be real high on my list. You know, things like food would be right up there.
Compass.
Maybe they had a cart full of tambourines. I
But
don't
when
know.
you read that, it made me think about in Africa when all the people got together on the island there, and each of those different tribes had their own tribal dance and songs that they sang. I mean, that just popped in my mind when we read through it, and so maybe it was of great importance to them back there that we don't have the
appreciation.
cultural,
Sure,
yeah.
sure.
I think they probably borrowed it from the Levites. Wasn't there a group of the Levites that were in charge of the musical instruments?
Yeah.
I think that's
Worship
where they
team.
got those.
Yeah, worship.
Well, and Aaron was over that, right?
Yeah, at least he didn't ask for a piano.
Oh.
Imagine bringing a piano through the wilderness.
Maybe they
Great,
found
yeah.
stuff to make one along the way.
There you go.
There you go, that's much more reasonable.
Because they have
Shells.
to be made, it's out of something.
Rocks.
Shells and skin.
Lots of rocks.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
they're headed out on a camping trip, they had to carry their tents, they had to carry everything, for the
yeah.
Marines.
They did.
Well, all right, they're there, so somebody had to carry.
There was a lot of them to do that though.
Yeah, sure.
The kids carried the tent.
There you go.
Yeah.
Kept
Even
you out of
for
trouble.
them to
They didn't
do
have the
taking
truck
out
and
fish.
show song.
There you go.
Yeah.
Something to play with.
Be careful when you open a can of worms in here, Mike.
You wanted an
That's
answer.
what makes it fun. Right, well, anyway, from right here to the end of chapter 18 is a journey to Mount Sinai, and there's a lot of fun to be had in this part of the trip here. So let's, Candy, do you wanna read, let's see, we're in
22.
oh, here we go, read 22 through 27, all the way to the end of the chapter.
Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they were 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. There he made for them a statute and regulation, and there he tested them. And he said, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters.
So 3 days walking into the wilderness and about to face the harsh realities of the desert here. Now, whatever amount of water they were able to bring with them apparently run out, and none had been found along the way. And providing for water in this hot and arid land is a real problem, even for small groups of travelers. But as we know, this is not a small group, so the difficulty is magnified. But after 3 days, they came to Marah, where there was a source of water. We're not told what the source was, whether it was a pond, a well, a spring, or whatever, but the place was named Marah because of its bitter water, and the Israelites are about to find out how the place got its name. And we see the response of the people here is similar to the one when faced with the problem of the sea on one side and the Egyptians on the other. And they do not yet have the faith that the Lord's presence is sufficient to provide and protect them through all kinds of challenges. And this lack of faith is going to continue, and the result is this generation of Hebrews is not going to be allowed into the promised land. And it's their lack of faith that is going to keep them out.
So
And
the
the lack of
bitterness
faith
is
is demonstrated in their behavior.
Is it like poisonous?
Well, I can maybe talk to that a little bit in just a few minutes here. So anyway, we see once again that they grumble against Moses, and in their eyes, it's Moses' fault that they're in this predicament. And this is only 3 days since the singing and the dancing and tambourines and proclaiming their belief not only in God but Moses as their leader. And again, let's not point fingers. I know very well we've all thought that God got me through the difficult situation last time, but I wonder if he's going to do it this time. So most, if not all of our problems are not life and death situations, but for the Hebrews, their challenges are life and death. And when faced with them, they don't see a way out. Because in their minds, these are impossible situations. But the more one experiences God at work, the more our faith grows. And that is God's will for our lives, to grow our faith. So from the Hebrews' acceptance of Yahweh as their God until they enter the promised land, from there to there, they are in their own wilderness. And from the time we receive Jesus as our Savior, we enter in, and until the time we enter into the promised land, we are in our wilderness. And the purpose is the same for us as it was for them, to get the Egypt out of us and to grow in faith and trust in God. Now, we need to understand about this grumbling. The word has a more intense meaning than what we would associate it with. It's not just this muttering under the breath, like, this stupid Moses, he's done it again. This is really a desperate, impassioned plea. Look what you've done. What's wrong with you? Get us out of this or we're gonna die. That's more the sense of the word here. So Moses' response to this is to cry out to God, it says. And again, this is an impassioned, desperate plea, this crying out, much like the grumbling that was done to him. And you will see that the instance of crying out to God repeated throughout Scripture. And I've read that in every instance of crying out, God responded and delivered that person. I haven't looked up all the episodes, so I can't verify that, but I find the idea kind of intriguing. And also interesting is God's solution to this difficulty. Now, we aren't privy to the conversation between God and Moses, but it says God showed Moses a log. And that can be translated branch or tree, and apparently he directed Moses to toss it into water. Now, we all know that throwing wood into bitter water doesn't make it lose its bitterness. There's no science involved in this. This directive must have made no sense to Moses, but Moses did it anyway. He is obedient regardless. And one commentator suggested a connection between this tree, branch, or whatever it was, and the cross. Each of them representing a form of salvation. I say, why not? I'm okay with that. But I'm guessing the water. Come on in. Welcome. Sit anywhere.
Yeah, we can do that. You can move them if you want.
We'll just pull this part. No, this is fine.
Oh.
It's all good.
We'll do some introductions later on. Find out who you are. We are in book of Exodus chapter 15, in the very end of 15. So I am guessing that the water becoming sweet after the wood was thrown into it meant that it was turned into clean, pure, refreshing water. And I wonder how long it took to dip out enough water for 2 million people. That's sarcasm.
Yeah.
But this was a test. This was a test, and they failed it. Now, don't get the idea that God gives the tests for God to learn something. Not so, okay? God knew they would fail. And it resulted in a life lesson for them in the form of statutes. And after failing the test, this was a good time to introduce the rules. This was a teachable moment. And the statutes there are an if-then thing. If you do this, I will do this. Now, from the grammar here, it's apparent that this is Moses speaking the words of God, that God had instructed him to say. And he reminds them that Yahweh is their God, no other God. And if they listen to his voice, right? Now remember, to listen implied the expectation of a proper reaction to what one had heard. And the proper reaction is to do what is right in God's eyes by keeping his commandments and his statutes. Now remember the problem of the Israelites in the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? Nothing but problems. And it is evident that the world really hasn't changed all that much. And you might wonder what commandments and statutes God's referring to here, since they hadn't arrived at Mount Sinai yet. Now, a couple possibilities. God may have already given them some rules that aren't recorded here. Or this could simply be looking forward to the laws that are given on Mount Sinai.
So I gotta ask a question.
Sure.
So what would have been their proper response, being in the desert for 3 days without water?
Grumbling.
That's not the proper one, right?
I thought maybe you were saying, how would I respond?
No, that's how I would be. I'm just saying, so what should they have done? I mean,
I'd
just
maybe gone to Moses and said, hey,
the
we got a
attitude.
problem, buddy, how are we gonna get out of this?
Yeah, more the
Cry-
right
cry out.
Go
Cry
to
out to
God.
the Lord.
In fact, we're gonna see that exact
Yeah.
response.
So it's okay to
Later
ask,
on.
but not
Sure,
to demand
why
and
not?
complain.
Yeah.
and-
I was thinking
Well,
along the
but
same
look,
lines.
you're gonna ask, you
Yeah.
have problems, you don't know where to turn, where do you go?
Yeah.
You go to God.
It's kind of the difference between, it's the
You
difference.
look through the Psalms, read the Psalms. The Psalms are full of people angry at God, bitter at God, complaining to God, and God says, I hear you. I understand.
That's what I was thinking too, just before that we need to learn in the little times of testing, so that when the bigger ones come, we're gonna be responding correctly, cause I don't respond correctly in my trials.
Oh,
And
yeah,
so
well,
I guess we need to really be learning and.
Yeah, I could tell you stories of our last camping trip.
But I think here it becomes the point where it's the difference of being allowed to be under severe stress, because we all know what it's like when you just have minor annoyances or you're under severe stress. And if you're out in the desert, no water, 3 days, you're under stress.
That's right. That's
And
a
you've
place
got,
where
and you've
people
got a
die.
large body of people and they're irritable. And it's like, so probably your request is gonna be somewhat tainted. It's
Mhm.
not gonna be this, but you're right. I mean, there's that difference between, do I outright grumble and say, God, did you just leave me out here to die? Is that what your intent is? Versus seeking the Lord in prayer and to saying, Lord, help us.
Yeah.
There's a difference in the tone.
Sure.
One is you've given up on us, it's all your fault, make it right, versus a humble request.
Yeah, and you know, and I've actually said these things to God. God, let's see how you're gonna get me out of this one.
True. It's more of an expectation
Sure.
of what
Sure.
you know he will
Yeah.
be like, you know.
And that's faith.
That is,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Mhm.
So, God tells them that if they do as he says, then they will suffer none of the diseases of the Egyptians. And we can only guess what God meant by the diseases of the Egyptians, but he says that the diseases that he brought on the Egyptians. So, apparently there's not gonna be a repeat of those kinds of
Right.
things, of the signs there in Egypt, but anyway, they'd already been spared what had been laid on the Egyptians in the plagues, but it could mean all kinds of other diseases as well. But I wonder if there's an implied threat here as well. If you've seen what I did to the Egyptians, and if you don't obey my commands, you better duck. Okay? And he ends with, I am Yahweh, your healer. I am perfectly able to protect you from these diseases. And we have to remember that as well. Now, if God is able to do what he had done to the Egyptians and for the Israelites, he's able to handle our puny problems. Okay? Because those were pretty amazing things, and compared to what happened there, our problems are not nearly that bad. Okay? Now, no matter what, God is able. All right, so on to the next place. The next stop is Elim. Now, there's no time frame given here, but right after the bitter water episode, guess what? Lots of water and shade, right? So, the numbers here are probably significant. Where have you seen those numbers before?
70
70
years.
and 12?
Yeah, 70 years, you get the 12 apostles, the 12 tribes.
Tribes. 70, there are actually some places in your scriptures that'll say 72 instead of 70.
For, exile?
Forget
That-
70 times 7.
That's how many came to Egypt in the first
There
place.
you go, that's how many
Oh,
came to Egypt in the
gotcha.
first place, yes, yes. So anyway, those numbers are probably significant, I'm not really sure how significant they are. But it appears as if this place were tailor-made for them.
Wow.
One well for each tribe. Okay? So by bringing them here, God's proving that he's able to meet their needs and do it abundantly. And he's teaching that they're to focus their attention not on their circumstances, but on the one who controls the circumstances. And we'll see still they have a lot to learn. All right.
What do you think they used, when they say they traveled for 3 days, do you think they just kept traveling for 3 days? Because it would have taken a long time to break camp, travel a little ways, set up camp, break camp, set up. Do you think they did
They
that?
travel 24 hours a day?
That's what I wondered.
No,
Could they have,
I doubt it, but
it just seems like,
for me, I wouldn't travel 24 hours
yeah,
a
me
day.
neither,
That would-
but not the day.
Especially not
Well, maybe nighttime's
Forget
better.
that cloud, I'm not
Oh,
following
at
that.
night it would be cooler.
It would be, yeah. Yeah.
Well, and if you think about it, there's women and children with them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you wanna know who was
Oh.
really whining and groaning grumbling. It was probably not the men so much.
I don't know, I can whine and grumble with the best of them.
I give them a run for their money.
That was
But then
interesting.
older people, I
I was
mean, not
just
able, right?
looking on the map here, it's not that far from there to Edom,
No,
so they, maybe a day's journey, and then they were good water and food again.
Of course, you know, walking around out there in the desert, everything is far away.
Right, it would feel that way.
Nancy, you wanna read verses 1 through 3?
Sure. Then the whole community of Israel set out from Elim and journeyed into the wilderness of Sin, between Elim and Mount Sinai. They arrived there on the 15th day of the second month, 1 month after leaving the land of Egypt. There too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death.
I don't know if Sinai here is a reference to the mountain or to the wilderness of Sinai, but we do know one thing from this. They are in the wilderness of Sin, and we know where that is. That's the area down here. And that's the wilderness of Sin, so they've made it that far. And it eliminates the possibility that they're in Saudi Arabia. They're not over here.
So Sin and Sinai, are they connected somehow?
Yeah, the desert of Sinai is sometimes referred to a bigger area and may include that. Sometimes you'll see it in this area on your map. I suppose it depends on which map you look at.
Always, yeah, some maps don't have it.
Yeah.
So,
All right, so anyway, they're 1 month out from the night of the Passover, and how many days did it take them to reach Mount Sinai from the Passover? How many days? Somebody knows that.
oh man,
How many days did it take them to go from the Passover to Mount Sinai?
40? No.
50?
50.
I was trying to remember.
Got
that.
it.
50 is.
50
is-
days.
That's right.
Yeah.
Celebrated by what festival?
Pentecost.
Pentecost. Very good.
Yay. We'll keep you in the.
All right, so they're 3 weeks away from Mount Sinai right now. And several things are yet to take place before they get there. So after 1 month of travel, they find themselves with no food and with no idea where their next meal is going to come from. This is not a pleasant situation, because I know I'm pretty tied to meal times. And we're told that the entire congregation gets in on this grumbling session. Now remember, this grumbling is more intense and passionate than we would normally think. And compared to their current situation, their life in Egypt didn't look all that bad anymore. You know, and at least they weren't starving to death there. Even though they were going to work to death, they weren't starving to death. Now, some of you have been believers from an early age, and I came to Christ as an adult. And I can tell you that there were times when going back to who I was seemed very attractive. And, you know, it was not always an easy task to stay within the lines. And I know that it would have been much more simple just to go back. And so I could really sympathize with these Israelites here. You know, notice they are now questioning Moses' motivation in bringing them out to the desert, bringing them out there to kill them all off. Now that's a pretty serious accusation, but Moses' ratings must have taken another major dip here. So, all right, James, you want to read 4 through 8?
Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether or not they will walk in my instructions. And it will come about on the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel, That evening you will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumblings against the Lord. And what are we that you grumble against us? And Moses said, This will happen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and bread to the full in the morning. For the Lord hears your grumblings, which you grumble against him. And what are we? your grumblings are not against us, but against the Lord.
God's response to their grumbling about their hunger and their accusation of Moses and Aaron is to provide. That's what he does. He's the God who provides. And he's going to do it in a certain way that will test the readiness of the Israelites to do things according to God's instruction. Now, keep in mind, God is not doing this to see what they'll do. He already knows what they're going to do. He is doing this so that they will see in a demonstrable way the condition of their own hearts. And God is still in the process of proving to them that it is He who brought them out of Egypt, as if they keep forgetting it. So Moses and Aaron pass on the message, and they tell them what God is about to do. And along with the message, he chides them for complaining to them about all this, as if he's telling them, don't shoot the messenger. Because Moses and Aaron are getting their instruction from God, and they're just doing what God has told them to do. So they tell their fellow Israelites, don't complain to us. Take your problems to God. I suppose that's good advice for us too. All right.
You wanna read?
You want to do
Mary?
some reading?
My name's Mary.
Mary, okay. Would you read 9 through 12, please?
Then Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And while Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in a cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God.
Now Moses gets Aaron involved in the communications, and Aaron says to them that God has heard. And we're not to ever think that God doesn't hear. God always hears. And we're not, so God is the one who can solve their problems, not Moses and Aaron. And these problems are beyond anything they can do. So Aaron says, draw near to God. And they're probably looking around and not seeing anything to draw near to. But they look to the wilderness, and right there, in the face of their problems, lo and behold, there's a cloud. So God's showing them that they have not been abandoned. He is right there in the midst of their problem. And
But they had the cloud before.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
that's God's presence.
yes.
And the fire at night. So what is different at this particular time, that they see, mine says that they saw God's presence in the cloud or something like that.
Okay, well, you remember what it says about the fire in the cloud. When they started out, the cloud would appear and the fire would appear.
Oh.
I don't believe that that was a continual fire that burned all night long. Or
Oh, I
it
thought
was when it was time to go, there's the cloud and they started to follow. When it's time to go, maybe they did travel at night because
Yeah, the
otherwise
fire-
why would they
fire
do
and
fire
fire
at
at
night?
night.
Yeah.
Oh, I always just teach kids, it's like a camping, you've got light and you've got warmth and he's there, you could, know he's right there.
And as they saw that, as they looked and they saw that cloud right there in the wilderness, I wonder if it made them feel a little bit small for all their complaining. When we complain about our circumstances and then realize that God is still in charge and He works things out, you ever feel a bit small? Yeah. So that evening, they'll get meat, and in the morning, it'll be bread. And the purpose for them is to know once again that Yahweh is their God. Hey, Janet, you want to read 13 through 16, please?
Sure. That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Each one is to gather as much as he needs. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent."
So that night, they got a lot of quail. And quail is only mentioned 2 other times in Scripture. There's another episode of quail in Numbers, and it is mentioned once in Psalms. So I'm thinking this is not an everyday thing. This is not an every night you're gonna get humongous flocks of quail every single night. So I think this is just one-time things that we're talking about here. But the next morning, there was dew, and when the dew evaporated, there was left something on the ground. And here it's described as looking like frost. There's gonna be a little bit more description of it here later on. We'll also see they named this stuff manna because it sounded like their words for what is it. I guess that's an appropriate thing to say when you don't know what it is. What is it? So they'd obviously never seen anything like this before, and they didn't know what to do with it. So Moses has to give them some instructions. And the first thing he tells them is that this is something to eat. Now, they may not have actually thought about that, and that Yahweh has provided it. Now, back in verse 4, God told Moses, this is bread from heaven. And this could be a foreshadowing of Jesus. It said in John 6, chapter 6, he says, I am the bread that came down from heaven. Now, and I want Janie's going to read a little bit more about what Jesus said about himself as the bread. So, this is chapter 6.
Oh, Mike. So one question. Well, it says in the morning it was like a layer of dew. What do they mean by a layer of dew specifically?
Well, it means that there was dampness over all the ground.
Okay. And I was like,
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
I will tell you the truth, he who believes has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna in the desert, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world.
So the effects of this manna here are temporary. It feeds them for that day. But the effects of Jesus are eternal. They will last into eternity. So the instructions are, each morning they are to gather it. Now they aren't going to get spoon-fed. They have to do something for it. And this is going to require a certain amount of work. Now in 2 Thessalonians, Paul cautions, he says, if a man will not work, neither let him eat. And so with the manna, if they don't do anything, they're going to get pretty hungry. Now further instructions here. According to the number of people in each tent, they're to gather an omer each. And your footnote probably tells you how much an omer is. It says it's about a half a gallon. Now God's pretty specific here, and there's a reason for it. We're going to see that in here in a little bit. So Harvey, you want to read 17 through 21, please?
Okay. The sons of Israel did so, and some gathered much and some little. When they measured it with an omer, he who had gathered much had no excess, and he who had gathered little had no lack. Every man gathered as much as he should eat. Moses said to them, let no man leave any of it until morning. But they did not listen to Moses. Surprise. And some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul, and Moses was angry with them. They gathered it morning by morning, every man as much as he should eat, but when the sun grew hot, it would melt.
Can you imagine the smell in your tent? The smell of maggots and it melting in the sun. You're like,
Yeah.
Well, I guess they learned something.
Hi, Michael.
Yes.
I'm wondering if this is it made me think about Jesus and how they were instructed to eat it every day and don't try to save it for the next day because it's not gonna work. So every day we need to meet Jesus to fill us up.
Very good.
That's good.
Very good, yeah. So it looks like for each tent they're to gather an average of 1 omer per person. And this was to account for the fact that some were able to gather much and some were only able to gather little, and some may not have been able to gather any. And here we see the principle here of generosity. the giving from one's excess so that others will have what they need. And that principle is going to be evident throughout the entire Bible. Moses tells them not to leave any overnight. It all needed to be consumed. And the reason is because it had a short shelf life. It got wormy and it stunk by morning. And this is by design. It is so that this provision of God is not to be hoarded. They're to learn to trust God every day for their provision. And this is going to go on for the next 40 years. And Jesus reinforces this principle of relying on God's provision when he talks about the flowers and the birds.
Right.
And that God will provide for us in the same way. But the underlying reason for Moses' anger is that they did not follow his instructions. He told them what to do, he told them to do something, and they didn't do it. They just didn't listen. And there were consequences. And it appears Moses didn't tell them what would happen, he just gave them the instruction. And they found out the hard way the why of their instruction. Do we need to get the point here? So they gathered it up every day, and the fact that it melted when it grew hot's a bit puzzling. How could it be left over until morning and get wormy? How could they eat it all day if it melted? But it just says it would melt. It doesn't, with the heat, it doesn't say it disappeared. So it could be that it had been edible even in its melted state. It may have just changed from a flaky state to a puddle. I don't know. But another option is that this is referring to the quail, I guess, and that makes some sense. But quail's not mentioned again until the next episode of into Numbers. Hey, Chris, you want to read 22 through 26, please?
On the sixth day they gathered twice as much, 2 omers. For each person and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be the day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is the Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any."
Here we have the first rumblings of the Sabbath's pattern of work and rest. It is going to be reinforced by the 4th commandment later on in chapter 20. So Moses gives them some more instruction from the Lord. He calls the 7th day a solemn rest. It's a holy Sabbath. So this is an important day for them. Not only is the rest day important for their physical well-being, but also as a matter of demonstrating their faith in God's provision through their obedience. So why is it that what was left over from the 7th day didn't get wormy and stink? Okay, now the clue is in verse 23.
Yeah.
What does it
He
say?
tells them.
Huh?
He tells them,
Well,
it's okay, you have permission.
yes, okay, but look at verse 23. Why didn't it get wormy and stinky? What did they do? They baked it or boiled it. Okay?
Oh, gotcha.
Okay? All right, so apparently that was some way to preserve it, and now, you don't buy that. The other option is that
I
God
know.
just did it that way.
There you
I have
go.
no problem with either one of those solutions.
Because I'm sure they tried to do that during the other days as baby oil.
I was gonna say, yeah, they would probably try it after he
Yeah.
told them that would work.
Right, and it wouldn't.
Yeah,
It'd still have a little
so
bit.
it's gotta be,
Well, you know, the better translation for this is that they bake what they should bake and boil what they should boil. Okay, so, anyway, like I said, I don't have a problem.
Probably said they were making bagels.
It could have been making bacon, sure.
Man, because they boiled it.
Yeah.
Now, notice that God commands them not to bother going out and try to gather any on the manna on the 7th day, because there won't be any. He tells them to stay home, stay there in your tent and rest. And to recall that God rested from his acts of creation on the seventh day. On that day, he did not do any more creating. And the idea is the same here. For 6 days he created this manna, but on the seventh day he didn't create any. And so he commands them to follow this pattern of work and rest. Okay, Karen, you want to read 27 through 30?
Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That's why on the sixth day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the seventh day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the seventh day.
True to form, some of the people go out on the Sabbath and try to gather their daily ration of manna. And I'd be willing to bet that they didn't do as instructed and gather twice as much or bake or boil the excess on the day before. And this would have been twice as much work on the sixth day, and I guess they weren't willing to do that. But they were in for a big surprise the next day. So God jumps on Moses for this and lets them know that they need to straighten up and do as they're commanded. And I'll be willing to bet that Moses passed this on down because it says the people complied there. Okay, what is your name?
Catherine.
You want to read?
I'm gonna pass.
Okay, we'll go back. Trevor, 31 through 36.
The house of Israel named the substance manna. It resembled coriander seed, was white, and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. 2 quarts of it are to be preserved throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." Moses told Aaron, "Take a container and put 2 quarts of manna in it, then place it before the Lord to be preserved throughout your generations." As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron placed it before the testimony to be preserved. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate manna until they reached the border of the land of Canaan. They used a measure called an omer, which held 2 quarts.
So here we have a description of the manna. I don't know anything at all about coriander seed, but it must have had the consistency of a wafer. And it says it had the taste of honey. It sounds like it was at least pleasant to eat anyway. And so Moses tells them that God wanted a memorial to this manna for future generations. And this was to be proof that the stories were true. And he instructs Aaron to put an omer's worth in a jar. And I guess it must have been baked or foiled to preserve it, otherwise it would have turned out
Or a miracle.
stinky. Yeah, sure.
Miracle.
Yeah, right. And Aaron is to place it before the testimony. And this was a reference to the 2 tablets containing the commandments that were to be placed in the ark. So this jar of manna was to be included. And you might ask why we're told that an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. Is that what some of your translations say? Yeah, it's because the volume of an omer changed over time. It would fluctuate depending upon through the ages. So God's given us the exact measure of an omer at this time. So this also helps to date these events.
Hopefully it's not, you know what an ephah is.
Yeah.
And they didn't have the tablets of the Ark of the Covenant at the time that they got the manna yet.
Right.
So it's written after, that part's written afterwards.
Exactly, yeah. And we're told that they ate this manna the entire 40 years in their wanderings, and right up to the time they camped on the east side of the Jordan opposite Jericho. And that was right up to the time that God called Moses home. It sounds like a pretty dull diet. It must have been a pretty complete diet, however, because it managed to sustain it for 40 years. And God provided, and true to his promise, it showed up every day except the Sabbath. So I'll stop there.